Wayfinder is a new shoot-'em-up hack-and-slash MMORPG that just released into early access a couple weeks ago, and after plugging away for about 100 hours, I just wanted to share with you my thoughts on the game and whether or not it's worth your money and more importantly, your time in its current state. Now, before going too much into pros and cons about the game, let's just talk about it. Wayfinder takes place in the world of Evanor, and you play as a Wayfinder whose goal is to fight against the gloom. So all of the characters that you're going to be playing, the characters that you're able to unlock, they're called Wayfinders. The reason why you're called a Wayfinder is because you have this special ability that lets you travel through these breaches, which is where you're going to be spending the majority of your time. They're basically the instance dungeons. And by going through these breaches, you're able to kind of transport to different areas and things like that, where you'll fight the gloom, you'll learn history about what's kind of going on, the gods of the world, the enemies of your world, and basically why the world that you're living in has been so shattered and there's only a couple safe places for humans. Now, Wayfinder, the game itself, is set up very similarly to Warframe, where it's pay for convenience. And what this means is basically you're able to purchase almost any weapon and character that is in the game with their premium currency, or you're also able to just grind out for mats and use those mats to create these weapons and these Wayfinders. A little bit more on that in a bit. Now, when you start the game, you're able to choose from 3 starter Wayfinders that all have their own specific abilities, as well as weapons that they start with. Don't feel like you're too locked into anything because you're also able to change which Wayfinder you want to play by crafting them, and you're able to change what weapon you start with, as you're able to just go purchase the starter weapons at least from a shop. They're super reasonably priced, it's not really outrageously expensive. So if you want to play a certain Wayfinder and say their starting weapon, so Silo, his starting weapon is a ranged gun. If you want to play daggers, which is Niss's starting item, you can just go buy them from the store. That's another reason why I say this is very similar to Warframe, because while you're stuck playing a certain Wayfinder that only has those abilities that are particular to this Wayfinder, you're able to switch around whatever weapon you have. Now, when it comes to the general pacing of the game, I would say that it is a lot slower than Warframe. Not in a sense of where you grind mats slower and you progress through the story slower, but you're not having to jump and dash and slide and glide through, these ginormous worlds, basically. You go at a pretty decent pace, you're able to sprint, you're able to dodge. The breach/map size is a pretty decent size, and there's also an overworld. In this overworld, you're able to basically, that's where you're going to be getting all of your missions. This is where you're going to do some side quests. There's some world bosses out there. And it's somewhat populated with both materials as well as mobs. However, I feel like the overworld isn't used a ton. There are some special little events that go on that give you certain items and accessories and things of that nature. But the majority of your grinding for materials as well as boss fights are going to be in those breaches. Now, while the game is in early access, there is a decent amount of content for you to play through, especially if you're the type of person that likes, switching up their playstyle, because every single Wayfinder and every single weapon has its own level system. These weapons and Wayfinders go to level 30, and as I played through the game with my starter Wayfinder and weapon, it took me pretty much through the whole campaign and a little bit of just after campaign grinding for materials for weapons and whatnot to actually hit level 30 in both of those. So the flow that they have right now is very nice. I mean, I felt like I was able to play the game, learn all of the different types of mechanics and features that they had, and I didn't feel like I was weaker or stronger than any of the other Wayfinders and weapons that I've seen. And it really more relates to what your type of playstyle is, basically. So if you want to use a shotgun, you can use a shotgun. If you're more of a tank, there's a character that's way tankier and revolves around sword and shield and stuff like that. Now, outside of weapons and Wayfinders, there are accessories. These accessories all have their own unique skill points, basically. So we have a pretty generic, skill base when it comes to ability power. You have crit power, crit rating, which is basically just how often you crit, weapon power, max HP, physical resistance, magical resistance, things of that nature. And these accessories basically buff those stats depending on which one you have equipped. There are some accessories that have a set bonus, so you're able to equip 3 accessories, and if you have 3 of the same type, basically, not the same exact one, but it'll tell you that this one goes with this one. And there are stat bonuses if you have a whole set, basically. Now, I would say one of the main features of this game is this echo system. Echoes are basically drops from enemies. Depending on what enemy you kill, you get specific echoes for that enemy. And these echoes have different rarities, going from common, uncommon, rare, unique, things of that nature. And basically, you're able to equip these echoes to your character, to your weapons, and to your accessories, And this is where you get a large majority of your stats. You're able to level up these echoes by fusing other echoes that you're not using. And it's very, very simple. They drop at a very decent rate, so you're never going to really like be out of echoes basically. And the currency that you use to do this fusion is found almost all over the world and very easy to farm. So it's a really nice system where basically if you're trying to really pack in crit power and crit rating, you could stack every single one of these up with crit power and crit rating. Now there are specific slots for specific types of echoes. There are attack echoes, there's like defensive echoes, there's balanced echoes, and if you slot them in the slot that has the same symbol, they will cost less than their full cost. However, you're able to put any echo in any slot. It just depends on how many total points that you're able to put on both weapon, Wayfinder, and accessories, and you're able to see that at the top. It'll tell you how many you have. As you level up both your Wayfinder and your weapon, that increases basically, and it also increases the slots that you have to equip echoes. So I thought it was a really nice system that kind of incentivizes you to either go and farm specific enemies that you want to get a high rarity of a certain echo, as well as make sure that you are actually killing all of the different mobs so you can see what is dropping, what specifically you're looking for. Now, like I said, there is an overworld and you will do a lot of like moving around here. There is quick travel, so you don't have to really worry about like walking everywhere. The world is a nice size. It's not too huge, but it's not too small. And like I said, you'll find world bosses and some special events in there, but the majority of your time is going to be spent in these breaches. Now, these breaches, it's a very simple, like straightforward system. You'll walk into the entrance, you'll press F, and basically that'll take you up to this queue system. Now, each breach has multiple different missions that you're able to do in them, ranging from like exploration missions where you'll go through, explore an area, and at the end you'll fight a boss, to just straight up boss fights. So you'll spawn in, you'll walk into an area, and you'll have to just phase through a wall, and then once you get in there, you're doing the boss fight. So it's nice because you don't have to go through this whole expedition mission to farm specific bosses that drop materials that you're needing. And for me personally, that kind of saved me a lot of time, and it's also very easy to differentiate where materials are coming from, basically. Now, these breaches, you're able to play online with other people. This game is an MMORPG, so you'll be running into people in the overworld as well as in these breaches. It is optional, so if you don't want to play with other people, you are able to just solo everything yourself. Difficulty scales with how many people are in the game, so if you're fighting a boss and people actually join while you're fighting the boss, you'll see the boss's HP multiply based off how many people are in the current breach. So sometimes it is easier to just play by yourself because the content is very soloable. There are a few things that it is recommended to maybe have a couple other people, certain bosses that have unique mechanics and are a little bit more difficult, but I would say 90-95% of the content is actually very doable for just one person. And this doesn't have any impact on the drop rates or like what materials are dropping. To me, it hasn't seemed like, I get better things when I'm playing with multiple people. It just might be a little bit faster. You also have less mechanics to juggle, so you won't have to like worry about dodging as much and things of that nature. Now, these breaches, both the expeditions and the boss fights, you're able to put imbuements on. Now, these imbuements basically change what items are dropping in the map, and it also increases the difficulty basically. So the greed mechanic, if you put a greed imbuement on a map, if it's an expedition, these piles of gold will kind of spawn all over the place, and you can walk through these gold like piles, press F, pick up a couple 10 to 30 gold, and it'll spawn a little gold mite. You can ignore that guy, you don't have to kill him, but basically greed is used to farm up a ton of gold as fast as possible. Now, the downside of that is the more gold that you actually gather, the more damage the enemies are going to do to you. So there are a couple different ones like Flora, Greed, Chaos, and there's currently 5 total, and each one of those have different unique mechanics. You're able to combine them. You'll have 2 imbuement slots. As you get farther into the game, basically, it's unlocked through story progression, and you can mix and match. So you can do like a Flora and a Chaos. You could do a Shadow and a Greed, and it'll make different little mechanics that are really, really fun to actually play with. Also, depending on which imbuement you're playing, will have different unique little interactions in the mission that are how you farm the majority of your rare mats basically. And I think it's a really fun system to kind of make every single mission that you do different. If you don't use any of these imbuements, you'd still have a chance to actually load into an area that has an imbuement. So if you don't have any, don't feel too bad. I've never had any issues making sure that I always have a ton. They drop very frequently from bosses, as well as just random chests and things of that nature. You're also able to craft them. So it's a very, very nice system that I think works very well in regards to making sure you always have these if you want to use them. Now, I feel like the second most important thing in this game is basically farming for mats, because a lot of people aren't going to want to put money in to buy, certain weapons and certain wayfinders. I will say that in the beginning of the game, their pricing was a little predatory. They have made changes, and it is a lot more fair in regards to how much money you need to put into the game to buy a specific thing. Like $10 is the generic price for the majority of the weapons, and like 15 to 20 is for the wayfinders. There are cosmetics that you can buy, as well as like emotes and things of that nature, but the pricing is much better than when it was when the game released. They've really listened to the community because they did make some very questionable choices. But if that's not for you, grinding materials is going to be very important. So obviously you want to know, is it a pain in the butt to actually farm these things? Because I feel like Warframe, it's hit or miss. Sometimes you get it, sometimes you won't. But the crafting times are really what's a pain in the ass when it comes to Warframe. Now, in this game, there are no crafting times. It's really nice. If you have the materials, you can make it. So for myself, I kind of played through the game not really going to farm anything in particular for the beginning. I wanted to get through all the missions and make it to endgame before I really started looking at like what materials I needed to farm. As I progressed, I hit max level. I hit max level on my weapon and my character around the end of the game, so it worked out pretty well. And then I was like, okay, I'm gonna make this weapon. So the really nice thing about this game is you really don't have to do any guessing in regards to where certain items come from. In the stores, you're able to press F, and this will tell you the location of every single one of the materials that you need to farm for that specific item. It'll tell you what imbuement you need to use to get it to drop. It'll tell you what boss drops these items. And I feel like that is one of the best things that a game can ever do, because it just saves you a lot of time. You don't have to go to some third-party website, look up exactly where it is. You might forget the name of the boss, but if you just go into one of the breaches, especially the main breach, because the main breach you're able to change around what location you're actually going to, and it'll tell you like, oh, this drops from the Deceiver. You go over to the breach, you go to the bosses, you're like, oh, I'm not too sure which one it is. There's only like a handful of bosses right now, so it's not too hard, and you see the Grand Deceiver. So you just, you go, you fight that boss, you kill it, and hopefully you'll get a drop. I will say that I feel like I've been very fortunate. My drop rates have been pretty good. I feel like I farmed up the materials that I needed extremely quickly, and I never really had too much of a problem grinding out my, first 2 or 3 weapons and my first Wayfinder. However, I have seen like on the Reddit and a couple of the forums on Steam that people are very upset with the drop rates. There's a couple items where you have to farm about 15 of a certain item to actually make them, like the Wayfinders, and it can be a giant pain in the butt to actually farm these. I guess the drop rates are very just random, basically, and it really just comes down to RNG, not in like, the generic RuneScape drop table where it's like, 1 in 32,000 or something like that. The materials that you need apparently drop significantly less often than, all the other materials. So some people are kind of getting a little frustrated with that, but I do feel like my, opinion's a little skewed because I enjoyed the grind. So for your average player, it might be a pretty poor drop rate. So this really just comes into like, if you're willing to just grind out the materials that you need versus putting $10 into the game, basically. The last thing I kind of want to talk about is this power score system. Basically, they have like a gear score, and the gear score isn't specifically just like your weapon or your Wayfinder. It's kind of the accumulation of your weapon, your Wayfinder, your accessories, and then all of the echoes that you have equipped. And as you grind out your levels, as you equip certain echoes and, rank them up, you're able to raise your gear score, basically. And now this gear score is used to kind of let you know if you're able to do a certain mission or not like that. They will tell you, oh, this gear score recommended is like 1400. And then it'll tell you how plus or minus you are to that gear score. If you're significantly above it, it will bring your gear score down, basically, to kind of make it to where you can't just like carry people through. But you'll still pretty much have a pretty decent time in any mission where it has to actually drop your gear score. I do think that it is very possible to do significantly higher gear scores as well. I mean, I'm doing like 800 to 1,000 plus occasionally, depending on like if I'm using a new weapon or something like that. So don't be afraid to try something before you actually, go and grind out some more gear score. It's totally doable. And this power level on the missions can change by using this little sphere over here. As you complete missions with, a level 1 sphere, you unlock the level 2. The level 2 is going to increase the gear score requirement and make enemies kind of harder to kill. and when you beat it a second time, you might get a level 3, so on and so forth. I believe it only goes up to tier 4 right now, as I have not been able to get anything higher than tier 4 even after completing it several times. But that'll increase the difficulty, and apparently it helps with rolls, basically. You're more likely to get certain items at the higher difficulty level if you're looking for rare materials. Now, this game, I do feel like, had a very bad rep. Like, if you go to Steam, you're going to see mixed reviews. There was a terrible, terrible launch. They grossly underestimated how many people were interested in this game, which was kind of surprising because their trailers and, their like previews and stuff like that, they had a couple early access like betas. They all did very well. And it was a very popular game. But apparently they just really didn't plan to have so many people trying to log in that day. And day one, it was terrible. Honestly, the first week was very, very rough. You would basically, especially day one, I played right when launch hit, hopped into the game. There was no queue at that time, so I got very fortunate. I was like one of the first people in. Thank you, Google Fiber. And basically, I got in, did the tutorial. The game crashed as I was going to the overworld. And then I had a 4-hour queue. After this 4-hour queue, the majority of people got kicked out again, and then they got back in another 4-hour queue. I'm sure you've seen a ton of videos of different streamers like Asmongold waiting for, 2-3 hours to get into the game just to be kicked and then have to load back into that queue again. So a lot of people were not happy, and that is totally understandable. You would assume that a company would be ready for this type of thing, and unfortunately they weren't. Now, the times I was able to get in and play for a couple hours, because you were very fortunate to be able to play longer than like an hour or two without getting disconnected. The game itself is very, very fun. The missions are enjoyable. All of your characters, your Wayfinder abilities are very fun and unique to use. The combat itself is very enjoyable. Melee is a little bit more, I would say, difficult than ranged. Ranged is just like you put out an absurd amount of damage in a very safe position, and you have a lot of like, especially for the character I'm using, you have a lot of ways to get away, basically, to dodge, giant AoEs and like damage, to run away from enemies and stuff. But the combat itself was still very fun. The boss fights were enjoyable, like the elite mobs were really fun to fight. Even the overworld, just kind of going around and like killing stuff when I was a low level, was really, really enjoyable. The missions are very straightforward. I will say that they don't really give you a lot of like guidance somewhat in regards to like which missions you should do, which ones are more important, which ones won't really get you a ton of experience, because it doesn't really give you a generic number of like experience you're going to get. It just tells you you're going to get experience. And so I kind of found myself going all the way around doing different random things. There are different quests like titles. There's like priority quests. There's like main mission, like story quests. There's side quests. So you can kind of base it off that. But the tracking system's a little like wonky too. Sadly, you can only track 3 quests at a time. And if you're not in the same zone that you need to be in, it won't actually tell you where to go. And I feel like for, new players or people that just like might not play this type of game, it's going to be very confusing to kind of figure out what you're supposed to do. That doesn't mean you're not going to have a good time. You just might not be like leveling up in the best, quickest way, and you might just kind of be doing missions that aren't exactly important. They're not going to do anything in regards to like story progression, things like that. But the game is in a very good state. It is very enjoyable. There are still, a couple things that they need to fix, like the world boss, the pyre. He crashes the whole game when you go and fight him. It's a blast. I've complained about this on Reddit. I've talked about this with a lot of my friends, and unfortunately, it's better than it was. Originally, when the game released, if you went and fought it, it would just crash the whole server. Now, you just disconnect, basically, and you have to restart your game. I guess that's a little bit better. They've talked about it multiple times, but this is one of the main bosses, basically, that you need to farm to get materials for certain weapons as well as characters. So it's very frustrating that you're not able to do that. There is a second world boss. There's only 2 currently in the game, and the second one had an hour respawn time. It was kind of absurd. And they actually were like, hey, we're sorry. They reduced it. That was nice. So if you go look on Steam and you see all the negative reviews, just know that the game launch itself was very poor. The gameplay itself is fantastic, and they've fixed all of the queue problems. There is no longer a queue. You might have to wait for like 30 seconds. But in my opinion, I have not been disconnecting randomly anymore outside of doing that boss. I don't have to wait too long to play the game, and the game feels full and like enjoyable. If you're a fan of Warframe, if you're a fan of just like a nice, hack and slash shooter that has, a magical kind of fantasy theme to it, where the majority of the time you're just going into different dungeons, killing different monsters, fighting different bosses, I do highly recommend this game. Right now, you can get the early access for $20. I don't really feel like that's too ridiculous. There is, I would say, about, depending on how much you're playing and like how efficient you're trying to be, around 50 to 100 hours of just like storyline and random things like side stories and stuff like that for you to play the game. When it comes to like grinding out Wayfinders and different weapons, there are hundreds of hours of gameplay for you there. So if you're the type of person that really enjoys going and grinding out bosses, fighting like different dungeons, farming materials so that you could build weapons, so you could build the new Wayfinders, you are going to enjoy this game a lot. Honestly, if you don't like Warframe, I don't know if I could really recommend this to you, because Warframe really is just like a one-to-one comparison. Everything is the same except for the pacing, basically. So if Warframe is like too fast and you don't enjoy how much you have to just run around, you can't really enjoy what you're doing and stuff like that, you might enjoy this if that's the reason why you were kind of turned away from Warframe. But if that wasn't really for you, I'm not sure if I think it's worth your time. And if you're not really a fan of like early access games, which I think people really need to realize what early access means. It means that it's going to come out, it's going to be buggy, they're going to have problems, things aren't going to work the way they're supposed to. It's not a fully developed game. And so if you can't handle like, inconveniences, things not working, random disconnects while you're doing something, maybe losing a little bit of progress because of one of those disconnects, you might just want to wait till the game actually fully releases. I think the game on full release is going to be fantastic. I would highly recommend full release date, whenever the hell that is, definitely play it. But if you don't really want to deal with that stuff right now, maybe go play Baldur's Gate or something like that, something that you really actually enjoy putting your time into. That isn't going to have any issues. As always, guys, hope you find the review helpful. I'm going to be doing more like, large amount of hour type reviews in the future. I feel like that's the most enjoyable for me. And it also kind of gives you guys a better idea of what actually the game is going to be about. So I'll do my best to keep you updated. And as always, I appreciate the support. And I hope to see you on the next one.